Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to the Michelle Meow Show at the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm John Zipperer, the club's Vice President of Media and Editorial, and your co-host for today's program. We hope you're staying safe and are well wherever you are, and we look forward to seeing you in person one day again at the Commonwealth Club's headquarters in San Francisco when it is safe to do so. Until that happens, we are doing all of our programming online. This is the latest in about 375 online programs that the club has produced during the pandemic so far. You can find all of our upcoming programs, as well as podcasts and videos from our past events at commonwealthclub.org. Now, if you're watching us today live on YouTube, use the chat box to submit questions for our speaker, and we'll work some of those into our conversation today. Now I want to introduce Michelle Meow. She's the producer and the host of The Michelle Meow Show and a member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors. Good to see you again, Michelle.
Thank you so much, John. And of course, thanks to the Commonwealth Club of California for providing the platform and the space to bring thought leaders together for these types of conversations. I'm pleased to introduce to you our guest today, our speaker, Amelia Pang, who is an award-winning journalist and has written for publications such as Mother Jones and the New Republic. She has covered topics ranging from organic import fraud to the prevalence of sexual violence on Native American reservations. In 2017, the Los Angeles Press Club awarded her first place in investigative journalism for her undercover reporting on the exploitation of smuggled immigrants who are recruited to work in Chinese restaurants. And so she's here with us today to discuss her first book, Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. Let's welcome Amelia Pang to the program. Amelia, thanks so much for being with us this afternoon.
So much, Michelle, and to the Commonwealth Club for having me today.
Let's start with the SOS letters. You know, what exactly are these SOS letters? How did they get here, and who's writing them?
This was actually one of several SOS letters that's been written by political prisoners in China and hidden in the products that they've made. So my book focuses on an American woman named Julie Keith who opens up a box of Halloween decorations one day from Kmart. They're brand new, and she's preparing for her children's Halloween party. And as she's pulling out the decoration and all the packaging waste, out falls this SOS letter that's written by the political prisoner who had made and packaged this very product in a labor camp in China. So my book tells his story, how this particular political prisoner ended up in a labor camp, what happened to him in the end. And it also steps back to look at the deep problems in our supply chain and some of the deeply flawed ways that corporations are auditing their Chinese factories and what we can do about it as consumers to limit the amount of these forced labor goods that are entering our stores and our homes.
And there's a lot of that we want to get into this hour. Let's kind of start at ground one or ground zero or whatever, which is, you mentioned how this woman she discovered this note in this package. How did you get interested in this story, and what sparked your knowledge of it and your decision to write about it and investigate it?
Well, I found out about this story the same time the world did when this particular letter went viral in news articles in 2012. And the New York Times and CNN actually did follow-ups and verified his account and interviewed the survivor of this particular labor camp detainee. And he had a really compelling story, and he was one of the few authors of such letters who had gotten out and survived. And he really wanted to still, despite all the torture and, terrible conditions he experienced in the camp, he still wanted to talk to journalists in Western countries and get his story told.
I think the world may have an understanding of cheap labor, but I don't think that a good number of folks, especially here in America, know about forced labor camps to the extent that you have uncovered here in your book. What can let's talk a little bit about these forced labor camps and how many there are in China who are operating.
Yes, unfortunately, these are not one or two camps. There's at least 1,000 camps, and that's a very conservative estimate, and they're holding millions of people. We know in just the Uyghur camps alone, that's just one population that's being detained at these camps. The Uyghurs are a Turkic minority Muslim group in China, and there's a lot of them being detained in camps at the moment. And just in those camps that hold Uyghurs, there are anywhere between 1.5 to 3 million detainees. They are forced to go through political re-education, which is really brainwashing classes to stamp out any kind of ethnic or religious identity they might have that's different from the state-sanctioned identity. And a lot of them do have to do forced labor in these camps. They're making all kinds of products from PPE equipment to human hair extensions to even the raw materials for solar panels. There's really not much these camps are not making, and a lot of these goods are being exported to the US and all over the world.
Now, you yourself are of Uyghur descent, am I correct?
Yes, my grandmother was from Urumqi, Xinjiang, and she, although she had grown up in Xinjiang and which the Uyghurs like to call East Turkestan because they think that they are, from their perspectives, Xinjiang is an occupied land that was renamed by the Chinese government as Xinjiang. But my grandmother grew up there and knew the language and knew the culture and very much had that Uyghur identity. But just in one generation, most of that was lost. My mom and her siblings don't know the Uyghur language at all, and that wasn't passed down to me at all. And growing up, even though I was always living in the U.S., I was born in the U.S. and grew up in the U.S., I continued to identify as Chinese only because that's the identity that identity we've ever known. And it's just, it's a shame that how quickly an entire culture can be lost from families.
And for people who haven't been following the Uyghur story, why are they being persecuted by the Chinese government? What is both the Chinese government say its reason is for these camps, as much as it does or does not admit they exist, but also then what do we know of what China is really trying to do there?
Right, that's a great question. Well, China has given conflicted accounts about the purpose of these camps. They say these are vocational training centers, although you do see a lot of highly educated people like doctors and even celebrities and scientists being detained in these camps. They don't need vocational training in manufacturing work. And at other times, the Chinese government has also said these are counterterrorism initiatives because there have been very, very small scale terrorism attacks in China. But even the US government has said that this is not a counterterrorism strategy because they're targeting simply too many people. Everyone is being detained in these camps, from old women to very young people. Whereas in counterterrorism, you might traditionally only target certain populations that might be vulnerable to extremism, like single men without a family. So it's just all of their reasoning doesn't really make sense. But what we do know about the camps is that the brainwashing classes really focus on erasing the Uyghur ethnic identity. And Chinese policymakers have even said themselves that they would like to see a single state race, which is the Han Chinese identity. And this is really a part of a larger initiative for the Chinese government to really keep people in line and not have any kind of alternative identities that may differ from the Chinese Communist Party. And and sorry, this is getting a little bit more in the weeds, but Xinjiang is a huge logistical and trade importance to China because of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this $1 trillion economic development strategy. And Xinjiang really is a core part of that, because this region in northwestern China connects China to a lot of different countries in Europe, Middle East, and Central Asia. And in 2017, we saw that China invested $66 billion into infrastructure projects in Xinjiang as a part of the Belt and Road Initiative developments. And in 2017 was also when we saw a massive spike in arbitrary arrests of Uyghurs. They're arrested for really arbitrary reasons, like a tendency to not curse. That could be a sign of religious extremism, or refraining from alcohol is another sign of religious extremism, and to the point where there's so many people being detained in Xinjiang that there's not enough camps to hold them. They're building these camps are. You can see from the satellite imagery that these camps are expanding at a pretty rapid pace, and but even that's not fast enough. You do see a large number of Uyghurs also being transferred out into factories across China through what's called the Uyghur Labor Transfer Program. And unfortunately, there are many companies sourcing from factories associated with the forced labor as a part of the Uyghur Labor Transfer Program.
We'll get into the trade situation a little later. What's the conditions like for those forced into these labor camps? What's happening to those who are forced into these labor camps aside from, the labor itself?
They don't have a freedom to go home, or even on their so-called break days, they can't even go home to visit their families or stay with their families. They have to stay in the camps, really. And there's a lot of torture that happens, especially for the women's camps. Sexual violence is very prevalent.
Now, it's not, of course, just Uyghurs that are involved in this. There's a large factor of the Falun Gong practitioners who have, in many cases, been sent to prisons. And could you give some background of what the Chinese government's issue is with first of all, I guess, explain Falun Gong, but then, the government's reasons, stated or otherwise, for taking such extreme action against them.
Yes. The focus of the story is on a Falun Gong practitioner who authored the SOS letter. Falun Gong is a Buddhist religious group in China. The Chinese government said they banned it because it's a cult, and maybe it is, but they also have a tremendous ability to organize large scale protests and other kinds of dissident movements, and that is a pretty big threat to an authoritarian regime like the Chinese government. And this particular individual who authored the SOS letter, Suni, he really participated in some pretty brave and bold human rights and pro-democracy activism work, and that's what landed him in multiple prisons, and including 2 forced labor camps. The Falun Gong and the Uyghurs are definitely not the only group that's in these camps. There's pro-democracy activists, there's women's rights activists, there's LGBTQ activists, there's civil rights lawyers who try to defend these people, because most of these people don't have access to lawyers. Most of these people have not been to court and received a sentence. They're just arbitrarily thrown there for an indefinite amount of time.
What about sorry, John, I'm going to toss to you for just a quick second.
Sure.
I'm having some internet.
It's been like that all around the Bay Area this week. So and I know you've addressed this in a number of ways, and you actually conclude the book kind of talking about maybe the one area of hope you have for this whole situation before we, as far as what people could do to try to change things. But I think we still kind of need to lay the groundwork of how much stuff that, for example, if you walk into a typical American big retail store, how much stuff are you likely to see there that could have been made by a political prisoner in China?
There's not much that hasn't been made, that hasn't been associated with forced labor, unfortunately. Last year, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute released a report which found 82 major global brands, and some of them are quite expensive, who are using Uyghur forced labor. And these included brands like BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Nike, and Lacoste. And this report was released a year ago, and it had pretty hard evidence. But out of those 82 companies, very few have actually dropped those suppliers. So there's really a large amount of products and brands being made by forced labor. And I don't think the corporations are willing to do much about it unless consumers start to demand it.
And that's a great segue to the question I wanted to ask, which is, how can consumers tell what they're buying, what they're purchasing is coming from these, labor camps, these where people are imprisoned?
Yes, that is the $1 million question. I think what we have to start doing is the next time we go shopping online at our favorite brand's website, just take a moment and look at their sustainability page or their corporate social responsibility page and see what exactly it says. See how much information or how little information these pages reveal, and that's what my book and research is ultimately about. Just what are you supposed to look for on those pages? Because to the unknowing reader or consumer, just seeing that a company lists a bunch of their factories' names and addresses, that may look really transparent and sustainable and ethical to a person who doesn't know that much about the industry. But it's not enough to just list the names of your factories. We have to start pushing a lot of our companies to also list more information about their sourcing practices. I've spoken with a lot of Chinese auditors whose jobs is to audit the Chinese factories to make sure there isn't forced labor there. And they said, at the current way that audits are done, there's no way to actually, it's very, very hard to actually tell if a factory is using forced labor or not. And that the core issue is that we're always auditing the Chinese factories, but nobody is auditing the companies' sourcing and purchasing practices. For example, I think we need to start looking for these types of information on our favorite companies' websites. We're start asking them to reveal this type of information, because these are a lot of the key factors that are driving Chinese factories to outsource work to labor camps. This includes how much time the company is actually giving the factory to make this product, especially if it's a last-minute production order change. When a company makes that change, do they actually extend the deadline so that the factory can realistically make it, or do they don't give them a deadline extension and charge them really high fines if they miss the deadline? That's unfortunately a common occurrence in the industry. When a factory doesn't actually have time to make the product for the time they were given, then they have to outsource work to some really shady places like labor camps, where just an indefinite, just so many prisoners can actually work on the product all night if they have to meet the deadline. And, I bring up time because this also ties back in with how we as consumers are shopping. When we reward the brands that are able to offer the lowest prices for the latest trends, like the latest fast fashion trends, then we are pushing our companies to want to shorten the time between design and production and distribution at a even faster than before, at an unsustainably fast rate. And a lot of times at the other end of the world, the factory just does not have the time to realistically make it to meet our consumer demands for the latest products and the latest trends.
You mentioned that kind of need for cheap and quick from consumers, and therefore the companies trying to solve it. But you mentioned there are some luxury brands that have been implicated in this. It sounds very difficult to track. There are online lists of companies you can go to if you're looking for companies that have good track records on the environment or LGBT policies and things like that. Is there any online resource that is looking at supply chains and human rights issues?
I haven't come across any that do a terrific job revealing all the details that we really need to see to understand if this company is actually being sustainable and transparent and really doing everything they can to make sure they're working with ethical factories. But hopefully with this book, more people will start demanding more information from these types of sustainability pages.
Speaking of, speaking up and doing something about it or voicing our concerns, what are organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, those types of organizations, what are they doing, or what are their responses? Are they effective against the Chinese government?
Yeah, and groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have been doing great work. For example, China had, for many years, a type of labor camp called re-education through labor camps. And after that was exposed, China claimed they closed these camps, but Human Rights Watch did a terrific investigation that found that these camps have reopened as drug detox centers. In fact, they're called compulsory isolation drug detox centers now. And they're very chilling places where people are detained and have arbitrarily and have to work still 15 to 20 hours a day. And these factories are so-called drug detox centers are exporting goods all over the world. I actually visited some of these drug detox centers during a reporting trip to China and followed the freight trucks and saw that, most of them were working with exporters. And when you look at the customs records, a lot of them are exporting to the US and all over the world.
We've talked a bit about why companies are subcontracting out or to prison labor or other reasons, but why does the Chinese government do this? I mean, are they benefiting economically from these prison factories? And if they are, I mean, is it to any degree that it really matters to what is now a very wealthy federal government there, or is it for them purely another means of punishment for people it's trying to control or eradicate?
These camps are certainly profitable for the Chinese government, but that's definitely not the only reason they have them. I would say it's more to punish any types of dissent in China.
Wanted to go back to a comment that you made regarding trade agreements and how they have an impact on the situation. And America we have a new president. There's a new administration. There are new ideas, or hopefully, new relationship. With China. What are your thoughts on what could potentially happen, or if you have some advice for the new administration?
I am hopeful that the Biden administration may finally get the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act passed. That could play a key role in really pushing China to rethink its policies. Because although Trump had started this massive trade war with China, human rights was never really a talking point during the trade war negotiations. But so our current trade discussions haven't had much impact in terms of human rights. But the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is important because it would ban all products from Xinjiang, not just individual products or certain types of products from Xinjiang that are currently banned, which are positive steps that the U.S. government has taken to get at least some regions in Xinjiang banned that are heavily associated with forced labor. But the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act would be key because I mentioned earlier, it is the Belt and Road Initiative and trade that really sparked the growth of these camps and the mass detainment of Turkic people in Xinjiang. So if you take trade away from China, then that could be a part of a huge push to push China to rethink what they're doing.
I'm glad you brought that up because, in fact, one of our audience members asked a question about whether or not you thought Secretary Pompeo's, former Secretary of State Pompeo's pressure on China had done any good. I take it from what you're saying is you don't think so because they were focusing on trade issues and not the human rights. But at the same time, you're saying those two are intertwined. I mean, can you talk a bit more about that? Because, for so long, both parties in the United States kind of set aside criticism of China in any real harsh way because it seemed it was growing so rapidly. The two economies were becoming so intertwined, and that came to an end under Donald Trump. And even I think critics of Donald Trump you're seeing among them a reevaluation of China as, instead of this possibly friendly economic rival, into both an economic and in certain cases, a national security threat. So maybe I guess I should phrase this as, do you think where American political opinion is now that we're better able to address something like this with this bill but with other actions than we were, say, 4 or 8 years ago?
It's hard to say. I mean, yes, what Trump did and what Pompeo did, it helped, but it didn't go far enough, in my opinion. And we will wait to see what the Biden administration can do. They haven't, they just came on board, so they haven't issued a whole lot of policies toward China yet. So I would like to wait and see what they come up with.
What's been the response for you since the debut of your book? Have you received any response from the Chinese government?
In a way, there's a lot of trolls on Twitter attacking me, and I know there are certain trolls that are associated with the Chinese government, and some that are probably just really nationalistic people in China that are offended by how China is portrayed. But other than that, no official response from the Chinese government.
Well, here's an unofficial response from one of our viewers. He says, I just finished reading your book and thank you for your eye-opening investigation. How many people do you estimate are working in forced labor camps today?
There's at least 3 million, and those are mostly in the Uyghur camps. And that's just one demographic. So it's millions total, but it's really hard to say exactly a specific number because to this day, we don't have a good understanding of the full scope of these camps because the Chinese government doesn't release any kind of comprehensive data that we can trust about these camps. We're just relying on individual human rights groups and journalists that are collecting information and satellite images here and there. So it's really hard to give you a specific number, but it is definitely the largest forced labor system that's currently still a part of the world today.
Wow.
I know that some individuals that you profiled in the book and included their stories, you'd mentioned some were able to escape or be freed from the forced labor camps. And so the question is really, how are people able to leave, and what kind of lives do they live after the fact?
Yes, they do release people, some people after a couple years, if they think they're behaving well, or if there's a lot of pressure from the outside to get them released and they don't want too much attention to this issue. Uh, but they live very difficult lives afterward. A lot of them have been pretty severely malnourished and severely tortured, and they do have a hard time readjusting to society again afterward.
Another viewer asks if you could comment on the growing surveillance state apparatus that has been set up in Xinjiang. I think across much of China, but can you talk about the it's kind of one of the leading state surveillance states in the country, in the world right now?
Yes, they have a lot of high-tech surveillance that are unprecedented, really, that they're using these AI-powered tools that can collect real-time data from surveillance cameras and flag people for, things like not attending a patriotic flag raising ceremony that they were supposed to attend, and flagging that as a reason for the police to check in on them soon. So these are, you really see the surveillance there taking a very disturbing turn in recent years, and I hope that other regions in China and other countries don't follow what's currently happening in Xinjiang.
And it's such a weird turn. It's in what we're seeing happening in China, especially under the current premier, is so the opposite of what the story had been and the expectation had been, certainly in Western capitals and Western economists for so long, which was that as China develops economically, that there would be this political pressure for democratization and, blah, blah, blah. And instead, it's kind of like they're getting a rerun of the Cultural Revolution, except with iPhones. I mean, it's people being sent to re-education camps because they don't swear a lot is it would be funny if it weren't so horrifying what these people are actually going through.
Right. You do see the rise of Xi Jinping. He almost resembles Mao in a way. He has this cult-like following that you haven't really seen among Chinese leaders since Mao Zedong. So I think it's a really relevant comparison to bring up the Cultural Revolution again.
There's a movement now that we can feel that is growing, in this movement of speaking up and fighting, or pro-democracy movement, I should say, is worldwide, speaking up for minority groups like Uyghurs and Rohingya. Kind of, what are your thoughts on the impact that it may have on China?
I hope people continue speaking up, because there needs to be more of it to have a real impact. At the current rate, you don't see a whole lot of countries, especially China's trading partners, coming forward to criticize China for their large detainment of Uyghurs and other political dissidents. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has invested a lot of money in a lot of Middle Eastern countries where that normally would speak up to see so many fellow Muslims, the Uyghurs are Muslims, being detained. But for the most part, these Muslim majority countries have been relatively silent, including Turkey, which is the Turks are a close distant relative of the Uyghurs.
You do note in your book that, directly dealing with companies and kind of putting pressure on them to, look at their supply chains and whatever, improve their audits or whatever, really question their business partners is one successful way to go, or one hopefully successful way to go. How would the typical consumer go about putting on that pressure? I mean, do they contact companies, or do they do social media or whatever? I mean, what is some practical how-to information you could give them?
Yes, I do talk about some practical steps we can take as consumers in my book. I think social media would be really helpful, probably more helpful than sending an email, a private email to to any corporation. Any kind of public criticism, especially one that can go viral and gain a lot of momentum, would be a powerful way to get our company's attention and really push them to change some of their policies.
I'm sorry, Michelle, I'm going to
Go
jump
ahead.
in, kind of a follow up on that. Have there been some good examples of companies that have, you mentioned earlier when this list came out and, BMW, Mercedes, and all these other things, there wasn't much of a reaction from them. Have there been any companies that you would praise and say, okay, this company did react well and honorably to this, revelation of this sort?
Yes, there was a company called Badger Sports that was found, one of the earliest companies to be found sourcing from Uyghur forced laborers in Xinjiang. And they received a lot of criticism in the media. And I think that was part of the reason why they reacted well. So Badger Sports makes athletic wear for a lot of college campuses and other types of university athletics programs. And there was some hard evidence that these clothing were being manufactured in a forced labor camp in Xinjiang. And so when they received all the criticism and the social media call outs, they actually dropped this supplier and cut off ties with them. And that's what everyone should do once they find out. I don't think they did enough to find this information out, because if the media was able to find out, they can find out too. But at least once this information came out, they dropped the supplier. But a lot of companies, unfortunately, have not done the same.
I think one thing I picked up in reading the book is a call out to kind of how we consume, and so many things that we consume, especially during this time of COVID-19. We might be questioning, do we need any of this stuff? And then what's the cost of this stuff that we're buying and the value of it if you knew that it was costing somebody else's life? Would love to hear, your thoughts as far as the pandemic and its impact, whether it could be a good thing or a bad thing, or a reset to address this issue of forced labor camps in China.
That is a great question. If I were writing the book today, I'd definitely talk about the pandemic reset. That's a great point. Yes, I think now is the time more than ever to really reconsider our consumption culture, the way that we shop. Because I do talk more about this in the book, but it is our consumer habits that create these factors that push Chinese suppliers to outsource work to labor camps. Let's say a company like H&M or Walmart or Kmart, they put in an order for 100,000 black hats. And then all of a sudden, a celebrity starts wearing lime green. So now all these companies want to change their order for black hats to lime green hats. And that's a pretty big change for the factory to make. And if the company doesn't give them much of a deadline to make the change, because they really want to capitalize as much as they can on the latest fast fashion trend before it's no longer trendy, then they're not going to give the factory that much time, especially if nobody is actually even watching their sourcing practices to see if they give their factories enough time. They have no incentive to do so. So the factory just won't have time to make the green hats. So they'll have to outsource work to places like labor camps where, the workers can be tortured if they don't make the hats fast enough to meet the deadline. And that really ties back to us as consumers. Do we need to buy that latest lime green hat to be as trendy as possible? Or can we really be okay with what we currently have? Or only buying things on a need basis rather than a want basis?
having written this book, could you return to China? And have there been any repercussions? Do you still have relatives in China and in the Uyghur lands? Have they faced any repercussions, or do you think they could?
I think they could. It's something I think about a lot, and I hope nothing happens to my family in China, because they had nothing to do with the book. They didn't even know that I was working on a book about this topic. Honestly, if they did, they wouldn't have approved of it, because most of them are pretty nationalistic people in China, and you kind of have to be to survive and have a nice life in China. So I hope they won't get punished, because they're not involved in any type of dissident work. But I don't know. I don't know if I can safely go back to China. We will have to see. I do have a 10-year tourism visa the Chinese government gave me for some reason. And that's why I was able to go to China and get a lot of reporting done, because I was on a tourism visa and I didn't raise any kind of flags for the police to follow me. But I will see. We'll see if that visa might get canceled soon.
Did you make a point of swearing a lot so they knew you were not too religious? Well, could you talk a little bit more about that? Because obviously, we've talked about surveillance and such. You were there as a tourist. You don't think the government was particularly surveilling you, or if you went back, I kind of think they probably would follow you around a bit, don't you think?
They probably would. But the reason why I was able to get the tourism visa in the first place is because the Chinese government is actually not that well organized, despite their immense surveillance capabilities, right? The local different branches they don't often communicate with each other or share information that well. So I'm sure somebody had information on me and that I was doing journalism, and I probably shouldn't be given a 10-year tourism visa, but it didn't get passed on to the particular embassy where I applied for the visa at. So you never know with these things, but yeah, there is a good chance that that might be the end of me being able to go to China, not surveilled.
Yeah, it's a great question, John, because one of the questions I had or thoughts was, if you ever felt scared to complete the book or your reporting of what was going on, just scared of the retaliation or scared of pressure that you might receive.
I was nervous when I was actually doing reporting in China. I was pretty sure that I was going to be fine, even if I got detained, because foreign journalists, even if they go on a tourism visa, they get detained all the time. And, for the most part, they're just trying to waste your time so that you don't get any reporting done. And they might hurt you a little bit. They might beat you up, but they're not going to execute you or sentence you to prison for years at a time if you're associated with the media. So journalists, especially foreign journalists like me who have never been a Chinese national, I was born in the US, we do have a lot more protection than the average person going there would, or the average Chinese national who live in China. So I thought I was in a pretty good position to report on this compared to a lot of other people. And I was nervous. I was nervous about getting arrested by the Chinese government. They're pretty intimidating, but luckily nothing actually happened when I went.
One of our viewers asks, did your investigation uncover Chinese labor camps being used to support the Chinese military specifically?
I didn't focus on the Chinese military, although, yes, the Chinese military, especially the paramilitary group, they're the Xinjiang Production Construction Corps. They are heavily associated with forced labor camps. And actually the US government banned all products that are made by the Xinjiang paramilitary group because they are associated with the military and they are using Uyghur forced labor. That's undeniable.
We talked about how the cost of goods here in the United States or products that are here in the United States, but maybe not too much touching on other countries and how they may play a role in the forced labor camps of China. Do you know of, just the impact, the worldwide impact?
I'm sorry there. I think I kind of broke up.
We talked a lot about, the products here in America and how Americans, consume these cheap labor, these cheap goods. And so my question was really about other countries, how they might affect the forced labor camps in China as consumers themselves.
Right. I think other countries most have not taken much step to address this forced labor issue. So unfortunately, even if just the US bans our products from China, that probably won't be enough. There are still a lot of other countries importing all kinds of goods from labor camps in China. But it is a start. Every little bit counts, especially from governments. That's a lot of pressure that can really, really compel the Chinese government to rethink its policies.
Another viewer asks if we could ask you to share a link to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's report you mentioned that included the 82 global brands that use Uyghur forced labor. Is there some place people could go to find that, or could you share it on Twitter or something?
I can share on Twitter. You can also Google Uyghurs for Sale. I believe that is the name of the report.
Okay. And people can find you on Twitter at Amelia Pang with an extra G at the end, correct?
Correct. Thank you.
Amelia, what did you do upon completing the book?
Well, I wanted to celebrate, but then COVID hit not long after. So, everything shut down. And I'm just grateful that I even had an opportunity to go to China right before the pandemic hit. It was I did my research in early 2019.
What's it like doing a book tour from your living room?
It's a little odd. I don't meet anyone in person. I haven't met any readers. People email me to ask me to send them book plates. But you don't go through the experience of actually signing your book. So it doesn't even feel like I published a book yet or that anybody has read it. Yeah.
Are you getting feedback from readers about the book itself yet?
Yes. I'm really touched. I received a lot of feedback from people who really want to take action. And I do feel heartened and hopeful that this is the beginning of a mass consumer movement to really hold our companies accountable. And I think it's important to have hope because as I talk about in the book, in the 90s, when you saw that kind of first wave of consumer protests against Nike for using sweatshops, it created some really incredible changes that were unprecedented, like even having companies do audit reports and share part of it with their consumers and start revealing what factories they source from. Like this kind of information, companies used to not share it because nobody asked them to share it or nobody cared. It never hurt their bottom line to not reveal this type of information. So, consumers do have a lot of power, and consumer protests are impactful. Unfortunately, we've haven't moved forward that much since that initial wave of protests against sweatshop brands like Nike. But maybe this is the start of something new. Maybe this, like you said, like you worded so elegantly, a reset after the pandemic, causing us to rethink our shopping habits.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is it too early to ask you about your next book?
I don't know how I would do this because I don't know how soon or if ever we could actually return to a normal after the pandemic. But a few years ago, I went undercover and I pretended to be an undocumented Chinese immigrant in Chinese buffets and really documented that experience of being paid below minimum wage at restaurants that primarily relied on undocumented Chinese and Latinx immigrants. and just the working conditions there. And it was really eye-opening because a lot of these buffets, they can only afford to be so cheap and offer unlimited kind of luxury foods like sushi and a lot of seafood because just the workers are living in pretty abysmal conditions. And I would like to eventually do a longer piece with more reporting on that, going to various buffets. So that's potentially down the line sometime in the future. I don't know when, but yeah.
It will be fascinating if you do decide to expand on that. And interesting, it's a similar general thing of something we consume without thinking about it, whether it's a matter of convenience or even luxury, and learning the backstory behind what goes into getting it to you and how that would upset people of morals, really.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always a human cost behind something that's cheap, whether it's made in China products or buffets. Yeah.
Buffets, they seem so long ago with everything that
Right.
we're going through.
Right.
And then hopefully, the restaurant industry is able to recover, at least here in the United States. If you're not doing investigative reporting or journalism, what are you doing?
What am I doing? I like to watch documentaries on streaming sites. This is not related to Made in China at all, but I'm watching a good one about medical devices that how the FDA doesn't really examine a lot of them very well before approving them. Yeah, it's on Netflix. It's pretty good.
We have a viewer question. Could you comment, on similarities or differences between what we've been discussing with these camps and Chinese efforts to tamp down the Tibetan people and culture?
Oh, yes. A lot of similarities. It's all part of the same system. Actually, the politician who really was in charge of clamping down on Tibet in recent years was moved to Xinjiang because he did such a great job in Tibet. So it's really the kind of suppression. It's done by the same people with the same tactics. And yeah, unfortunately, I don't think it's okay anymore for us to just criticize China from afar and say it's just the Chinese government's problem. We as consumers are also contributing to ethnic minorities' forced labor.
Amelia, I wanted to thank you so much again for being here with us, and wanted to remind folks, actually, grab the book if you haven't done so, and the title of it, Made in China. And I'm going to get the full title for you. It is Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. So, I liked a question that I heard from an interview that you did before, and I wanted to ask the same question as we wind down. And it really is, you've hit on it already throughout this hour, but if we could repeat some of it again, but a message to American consumers, anybody who's tuning in right now, who's listening, or around the world even, in kind of giving some perspective on how we can make a change. We can save people's lives from these forced labor camps.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Yes, I do want to show my book to everyone that it does detail actionable steps we can take to reduce or even stop forced labor from ending up in our stores and our homes. And that starts with really demanding our companies start revealing their sourcing practices. Are our companies paying their factories enough money to actually make the product in-house? Or are the cheap prices that we love contributing to factories having no choice but to outsource work to labor camps? We do have to remember that China has just an excess of factories. There's so many, and they're so competitive with each other. If any of them can get a contract with a big global brand like H&M or Kmart, or even the more expensive ones, that's a really, really big deal to them. They will go to any length necessary to keep that contract and keep that brand happy, even if it means doing illegal subcontracting to prison work. A lot of them, even if they want to be ethical and follow the court requirements, they simply can't due to the incredibly low prices they're given. Even if it's an expensive company like BMW, if they're not actually, even though they have the money to pay workers more in China, but if they're not actually giving their factories that much more money because they're concentrating on more of their bottom line for their CEOs, if it's not enough money, then their factories are still outsourcing work to forced labor. The issue is not just the cheap products alone. So that starts with us as consumers, asking our companies to start revealing what kind of prices are you offering to your factory? Can that price realistically support wages in that local region? And how much time do you give your factories to make these products? And if that realistically is enough time for a factory to make it.
Journalist Dexter Roberts was at the Commonwealth Club recently talking about his book on Chinese capitalism and the kind of the underside of it, the migrant workers and the education problems and the lesser healthcare that they and their children are receiving and such. But he was talking about how China's government has recognized that its role as the cheap factory to the world is changing, and that if it's not coming to an end, it's reducing, and so it's been trying to build up more of a domestic market, which and therefore and also then compounded by this pandemic, where you've seen a number of U.S. manufacturers start to go toward nearshoring to shorten up their supply lines and have their suppliers be closer by. But it kind of raises the question to me of, well, how do, granted the Chinese government is not publicizing these labor camps to their own people, but stories must get out from people who leave, and there must be, various underground media and such. Do you have any sense of how Chinese people would react or are reacting? Would they care? Would they put any pressure on it? Or would they support the government in its efforts to keep things going as they are?
I think there are certain groups who wouldn't support outsourcing work to labor camps, like the labor unions in regular factories. It does hurt the workers when factories have this incredibly cheap and fast production force that they can outsource work to. But I think for larger population in China, I think that a lot of them don't actually care because they're not actually aware of how horrific these places are. The Chinese government kind of paints them as rehabilitation centers that teach prisoners skills. So a lot of them don't necessarily see this type of prison labor as something bad, and it's not illegal for domestic companies to source products from these types of camps. So I don't see there being a big movement domestically in China, but international movements can play a big role because China is a huge exporter, the world's factory floor.
And I hope that that's what we've achieved here in the last hour, is informing and educating all of you who've tuned in today to hear Amelia Pang. Go ahead and grab a copy of her book if you can, Made in China, Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. Amelia, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle Miao and John Zipper. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much to Commonwealth Club for having me. Yes, please keep in touch. And I look forward to meeting you all in person one day when this is all over.
Exactly. And John, you have the last words.
I'll wrap it up and I'll repeat our thanks to you, Amelia Pang. And thank you all of you for watching or listening to this program. You can find our upcoming list of programs as well as video and audio from past programs at commonwealthclub.org/MMS. We've got a great slate of programs coming up. You won't want to miss them. So have a good rest of your week, good weekend, and stay safe and healthy, everyone.